The saloon doors didn't swing open with a cinematic crash. They simply groaned, heavy with the relentless grit of the Wyoming plains. Inside, the air was a suffocating soup of cheap tobacco, spilled rye, and the cruel, booming laughter of men who ruled the frontier by the iron of their guns. At the center of the room stood Emmett Carver, a brutal enforcer whose reputation was carved into pine headboards from Texas to the Dakotas. He thought the dusty, quiet drifter at the bar was just another tragic fool to be bullied. He sneered. The whole room erupted in laughter, and then the drifter spoke just a handful of words that froze the blood in their veins. "You just insulted the wrong man." Cheyenne, Wyoming, in the late autumn of 1882, was not a town that forgave weakness. The harsh winds, sweeping down from the Bighorn Mountains, carried the bitter promise of a brutal winter, but the cold outside was nothing compared to the icy cruelty within the walls of the Copper Queen Saloon. The town was a powder keg, deeply divided between the wealthy cattle barons of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association and the desperate homesteaders trying to fence off their modest claims. The Copper Queen was neutral ground in name only. In reality, it was the personal fiefdom of Emmett Carver. Carver was a mountain of a man, clad in a tailored broadcloth coat that barely concealed the twin Colt revolvers riding low on his hips. He was the chief regulator for Thomas Laramie, the wealthiest cattle baron north of Denver. Carver's job was simple: intimidate, burn, and when necessary, kill any small-time rancher who dared to lay barbed wire across Laramie's open range. On this particular Tuesday evening, Carver was holding court. He had backed a terrified sheep farmer named Josiah Miller against the brass rail of the mahogany bar. Miller's face was bruised, a thin trickle of blood running from his split lip into his wiry gray beard. Carver's men, a twitchy young killer named Billy Higgins and a hulking brute simply called Amos, stood on either side, chuckling as their boss toyed with the old man. "I'm telling you for the last time, Josiah," Carver drawled, his voice a gravelly rumble that carried over the tinny plinking of the saloon's upright piano. "That valley belongs to the association. Governor Hale himself signed the land grants. You string one more mile of wire, and I won't just burn your barn. I'll make sure you and your boys are in it." Josiah trembled, gripping his battered felt hat in his hands. "We got a legal right, Emmett. The Homestead Act." Carver slapped the hat out of the old man's hands. The piano player abruptly stopped playing. The room went deathly quiet. It was into this suffocating silence that the stranger walked. He didn't swagger, and he didn't check the room with the paranoid eyes of an outlaw. He simply walked to the far end of the bar, his boots making a soft, rhythmic thud against the sawdust-covered floorboards. He wore a long canvas duster, heavily caked with the pale, alkaline dust of the trail. The collar was turned up, hiding the lower half of a face shadowed by the wide brim of a worn Stetson. He didn't look at Carver. He didn't look at the bleeding sheep farmer. He just placed a silver dollar on the scarred wood of the bar and looked at the terrified bartender. "Whiskey," the stranger said. His voice was neither loud nor deep, but it possessed a strange, resonant clarity that seemed to cut right through the heavy atmosphere of the saloon. "Leave the bottle." Carver, unaccustomed to being ignored, slowly turned his head. His dark, deep-set eyes locked onto the solitary figure. The enforcer's pride was a fragile, dangerous thing. He took a step away from Josiah, his heavy boots sounding like a death knell in the quiet room. "Well now," Carver said, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "Looks like we got ourselves a tourist." The stranger didn't reply. The bartender, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the glass, poured a measure of amber liquid and slid it across the bar. The stranger picked it up, sniffed it, and took a slow sip. Carver closed the distance, stopping just a few feet away. Billy and Amos fanned out behind him, sensing their boss's shifting focus. "I don't recall seeing you in Cheyenne, friend," Carver said, leaning his elbow heavily on the bar. You working for the association, or are you just another dirt-scratching sodbuster looking for a quick grave?" The stranger set his glass down. He didn't turn his head. He just stared straight ahead at the hazy mirror behind the bar. "I'm just a man having a drink. The dirt and the graves are none of my business." Carver chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Everything in this town is my business, which means you're my business." He reached out with a thick, calloused finger and poked the stranger hard in the shoulder. "So why don't you take that fancy coat, turn around, and ride back to whatever miserable hole you crawled out of before I decide to make an example out of you?" The stranger finally turned. For the first time, Carver saw the man's eyes beneath the brim of his hat. They were a pale, washed-out gray, like the sky right before a blizzard breaks. There was no fear in them. There wasn't even anger. There was just a chilling, absolute emptiness. "I paid for the bottle," the stranger said softly. "I intend to finish it." Carver stared at him for a long moment, and then he threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming guffaw that echoed off the tin ceiling. Billy and Amos immediately joined in, followed by the rest of Carver's men scattered around the room. Within seconds, the entire saloon, fueled by fear and the desire to appease the enforcer, was roaring with laughter at the dusty drifter's expense. They laughed at his audacity, at his impending inevitable death. The stranger stood perfectly still, letting the wave of mockery crash over him. He slowly reached into the inside pocket of his duster. Billy Higgins tensed, his hand dropping to his holster, but Carver waved him off, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "Let him be, Billy. Let's see what the sodbuster's got. Probably a pocket Bible or a picture of his ugly mother." The stranger withdrew his hand. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a small, crumpled piece of heavy parchment. He laid it flat on the bar, right next to his glass of whiskey. The laughter began to die down as Carver leaned in, squinting in the dim light to read the elegant official cursive writing at the top of the parchment. It was a warrant, but it wasn't a local bounty poster. It bore the heavy wax seal of the Federal District Court in Fort Smith, Arkansas, the domain of the infamous hanging judge, Isaac Parker. Carver's laughter caught in his throat. He looked from the warrant to the stranger. The drifter calmly picked up his glass, finished his whiskey, and set it down with a sharp clack. "You just insulted the wrong man," the Nameless Gunslinger said. The profound silence that followed those words was heavier than lead. The saloon patrons, men who had survived Indian raids, cholera, and range wars, collectively held their breath. The shift in the room was palpable, a sudden suffocating drop in barometric pressure right before Twister touches down. Emmett Carver's eyes darted rapidly across the lines of the federal warrant. His mind, dulled by arrogance and rye whiskey, struggled to process the name written in the blank space. It wasn't his name. It was the name of a man who had died in a burning farmhouse in Begazar County, Texas, 5 years ago. A man Carver had killed. "Where did you get this?" Carver breathed, the gravelly bravado completely gone from his voice. His hand hovered over the walnut grip of his right hand cold. "I took it off a dead man in Abilene," the stranger replied, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "He told me a very interesting story about a man named Emmett Carver, about how Carver didn't actually burn the evidence. He kept it, used it to buy his way into Thomas Laramie's good graces. Billy Higgins, young, stupid, and eager to prove himself, couldn't handle the tension. He didn't understand the nuance of the conversation. He only understood that his boss had been challenged. "I don't give a damn what that paper says," Billy shouted, his voice cracking. He ripped his revolver from its holster. He never even managed to cock the hammer. The stranger moved with a terrifying liquid speed that defied the heavy duster he wore. He didn't adopt a duelist stance. He simply pivoted on his heel, his right hand blurring to his hip. The thunderous roar of his modified Colt Peacemaker shattered the silence. The flash of the muzzle illuminated the dim saloon in a stark strobe light burst of yellow and white. The heavy .45 caliber slug caught Billy Higgins square in the sternum, lifting the young man off his boots and throwing him backward into a poker table. The table splintered, sending cards, chips, and cheap whiskey flying into the air. Before Billy hit the ground, the stranger was already moving. Amos, the hulking brute, roared like a wounded bear and lunged forward, reaching for the stranger with massive outstretched hands, forgoing his gun entirely in his blind rage. The stranger didn't back away. He stepped into the charge. He ducked under Amos's grasping hands, bringing the heavy steel barrel of his Colt up in a vicious arc. The metal connected with the underside of Amos's jaw with a sickening crack, shattering bone. As Amos staggered backward, clutching his ruined face, the stranger fanned the hammer of his Colt once, putting a round through the giant's kneecap. Amos went down, screaming in agony. 2 seconds had passed. 2 men were down. Carver finally cleared leather. He drew both his revolvers, stepping back to put distance between himself and the demon in the duster. The enforcer fired blindly, the deafening cracks of his guns adding to the absolute chaos. The stranger threw himself sideways, diving behind a heavy oak pillar as splinters rained down on him from Carver's wild shots. The saloon erupted into pandemonium. Patrons scrambled for the exits, diving out of windows and trampling each other in their desperation to escape the crossfire. "You're a dead man!" Carver screamed, his voice cracking with panic as he fired again and again, obliterating the mirror behind the bar and sending a shower of glass down onto the terrified bartender who was curled into a ball on the floorboards. "You hear me? You're dead!" The stranger didn't answer. He waited, his breathing slow and measured, listening to the mechanical clicks and booms of Carver's weapons. He was counting the shots. 4, 5, 6. Carver's right gun clicked empty. In that microsecond of hesitation, as Carver shifted his weight to fire with his left hand, the stranger stepped out from behind the pillar. He didn't rush his shot. He raised his Colt, the smoke still curling lazily from the barrel, and sighted down the barrel. He squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck Carver in the right shoulder, spinning him violently around. Carver cried out, dropping his empty gun, but managed to raise his left hand, firing a desperate shot that tore through the canvas of the stranger's duster, grazing his ribs. The stranger didn't flinch. He cocked the hammer again and fired. The second bullet took Carver in the right thigh. The enforcer's leg gave out and he collapsed onto the sawdust-covered floor, gasping for air, blood pouring from his wounds and staining his expensive broadcloth coat. The deafening roar of gunfire faded, replaced by the ringing in their ears, the groans of the wounded Amos, and the harsh, ragged breathing of Emmett Carver. The thick smell of sulfur and burning powder hung heavy in the room, creating a pale fog that drifted lazily toward the ceiling. The stranger slowly lowered his gun. He ejected the spent casings, the brass cylinders clinking softly onto the floor, and methodically loaded fresh cartridges from the loops on his belt. Only when his weapon was fully reloaded did he walk over to where Carver lay bleeding. He kicked Carver's remaining gun out of reach, then knelt beside the fallen enforcer. Carver looked up at him, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. Who the hell are you?" he rasped. "I told you," the stranger said, picking up the crumpled federal warrant from the floor where it had drifted during the fight. He folded it neatly and slipped it back into his pocket. "I'm the wrong man." The heavy oak doors of the Copper Queen swung open, letting in a blast of the freezing Wyoming night. Standing in the threshold, silhouetted against the gas lamps of the street, was Sheriff John Burnett. He held a Winchester lever-action rifle at his hip, his eyes quickly taking in the carnage. Burnett was a hard, pragmatic man. He had survived 10 years as a lawman in Cheyenne by knowing exactly when to look the other way and when to assert authority. He looked at the shattered mirror, the groaning Amos, the dead body of Billy Higgins tangled in the broken poker table, and finally, at the stranger standing over the bleeding Emmett Carver. "Drop the iron, stranger," Burnett commanded, jacking around into the chamber of his Winchester. The metallic clack was loud in the quiet saloon. The stranger slowly turned his head. He didn't drop his Colt, but he smoothly slid it back into the leather holster on his hip. He kept his hands in plain sight, resting them easily on his belt. "No need for that, Sheriff," the stranger said. "Mr. Carver here just had a sudden, violent reaction to some bad news. It was self-defense. The bartender can testify to it if he ever comes out from behind that counter." Burnett stepped cautiously into the room, keeping his rifle trained on the stranger. He walked over to Carver, looking down at the enforcer with a mixture of disgust and apprehension. Carver, bleeding on the floor, was going to bring the wrath of Thomas Laramie down on the town, and Burnett knew it. "You got a lot of nerve, drifting into my town and shooting up the association's men," Burnett said. "Laramie is going to hang you from the telegraph pole outside the train station." The stranger reached slowly into his vest pocket. Burnett tensed, raising the rifle slightly. "Easy, Sheriff," the stranger murmured. He pulled out a small, flat leather wallet and tossed it underhanded. Burnett caught it out of the air. He flipped it open. Pinned to the inside leather was a silver star-shaped badge with an unblinking eye engraved in the center. Below it, stamped into the metal, were the words, "Pinkerton National Detective Agency." Burnett's face changed. The bravado melted away, replaced by a deep, cautious respect. The Pinkertons were not local law. They were a national force employed by railroad tycoons, the federal government, and men who could buy and sell a town like Cheyenne before breakfast. To cross a Pinkerton agent was to invite a ghost into your home. They were relentless, heavily armed, and answered to a higher power than any local cattle baron. "You work for Allen's boys in Chicago?" Burnett asked, lowering the rifle slightly. "I report directly to William Pinkerton," the stranger said, stepping away from Carver. "And I'm not here for a range war, Sheriff. I'm here for a ledger." Carver, clutching his bleeding shoulder, let out a wet, rattling laugh. You're crazy. You think you can just walk in here and take it?" The stranger looked down at him. "You stole a black leather ledger from a Union Pacific Express car 3 weeks ago outside of Laramie. That ledger contains the financial records of Thomas Laramie's bribery payments to Governor Hale and 3 federal land commissioners. You killed 2 railway guards to get it." Burnett whistled low through his teeth. "Bribery? Laramie? The association is trying to legally lock down millions of acres of public grazing land," the stranger explained, looking at the sheriff. "They're using the state government to do it. The Union Pacific hired the agency to recover the ledger before Laramie can destroy the evidence. They want their land routes protected." Carver groaned, shifting his weight. "Laramie, he's got it locked up tight. You'll never get near his ranch. He's got 30 men riding the perimeter." "I don't need to go to his ranch," the stranger said softly. He reached down and grabbed Carver by the lapels of his ruined coat, hauling him halfway off the floor. Carver screamed in pain. "Because Thomas Laramie doesn't have it. You do." Burnett looked confused. "What do you mean Carver has it? Why wouldn't he give it to his boss?" "Because Mr. Carver is an opportunist," the stranger said, his gray eyes locked onto Carver's terrified face. He realized that a book detailing the illegal activities of the most powerful man in the territory is an excellent insurance policy. He told Laramie the ledger burned in the train car fire, but he kept it, hid it, hoping to use it to blackmail his way into a partnership. Carver's silence was all the confirmation they needed. "Where is it, Emmett?" the stranger asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Tell me where it is, and I'll have the sheriff here fetch the doctor. You'll stand trial in Fort Smith for the railway guards. You might live to see old age in a federal cell. You don't tell me, and I'll walk out that door, find Thomas Laramie, and tell him exactly what his loyal lapdog has been hiding." Carver's eyes widened in sheer panic. He knew what Laramie did to traitors. A federal prison was hell, but Laramie's vengeance would be slow, agonizing, and final. The livery stable," Carver gasped out, spittle flying from his lips. "Miller's livery at the edge of town. Stall number 4. It's buried under the feed trough in a waterproof canvas sack." The stranger let go of Carver's coat, letting the heavy man slump back onto the sawdust. He looked at Sheriff Burnett. "Get him the doctor, Sheriff," the stranger said, turning toward the door. "And wire the U.S. Marshal in Denver. Tell him you have a federal prisoner ready for transport." "Where are you going?" Burnett asked, stepping out of the way. The stranger paused at the doorway, the Wyoming wind violently whipping the edges of his duster. He pulled his hat down low over his eyes. "To dig up a book," he said, "and then I'm going to have a conversation with Thomas Laramie." He stepped out into the freezing night, leaving the bloody chaos of the Copper Queen behind him, the silent hunter moving into the dark. The Wyoming wind howled like a wounded animal as the nameless Pinkerton agent pushed his way down the unpaved, rutted main street of Cheyenne. The freezing air bit at the exposed skin of his face, but he moved with a relentless, measured stride. The tin-roofed buildings offered little shelter, their wooden facades groaning under the invisible assault of the gale. Miller's livery stood at the very edge of town, a sprawling, drafty barn constructed of rough-hewn pine and smelling sharply of damp straw, sweet molasses feed, and horse manure. A single, soot-stained lantern swung violently on a rusted hook above the main double doors, casting long, erratic shadows that danced across the frosted mud. The agent didn't use the main doors. He slipped around to the side alley, finding a smaller, heavy-timbered side entrance. He lifted the iron latch with the barrel of his Colt, the well-oiled hinges yielding with only a soft whisper. Inside, the barn was a cavern of deep shadows and the rhythmic sounds of restless livestock. Horses stamped their hooves in the dirt, blowing warm air from their nostrils. The air was thick and relatively warm compared to the bitter street. He paused, letting his pale gray eyes adjust to the gloom. He listened. Beneath the rustle of hay and the shifting of massive equine bodies, there was only the wind outside. He moved silently down the central aisle, counting the wooden partitions. 1, 2, 3, 4. Stall number 4 was empty of a horse, currently serving as a storage space for broken harnesses and molding sacks of oats. At the far end sat a heavy iron-bound wooden feed trough, half buried in the packed dirt floor. The agent knelt, pulling a small, heavy-bladed hunting knife from his boot. He plunged the blade into the earth at the base of the trough, loosening the soil. It took 5 minutes of furious, silent digging before the point of his knife scraped against something that wasn't rock or root. It was thick, waxed canvas. He brushed the dirt away with his bare hands, grasping the heavy bundle and hauling it free. He unknotted the stiff leather twine binding the sack and reached inside. His fingers brushed the cold, smooth surface of leather binding. He pulled it out, a thick black ledger, exactly as Carver had described. He flipped it open in the dim moonlight filtering through the slats of the roof. The pages were filled with columns of neat, meticulous handwriting, dates, sums of money, and names. Governor Hale, Land Commissioner Davies, Judge Colfax. It was a ledger of damnation. Enough to hang half the territorial government and send Thomas Laramie to federal prison for the rest of his natural life. "You know, I always figured Carver was too stupid to play a double game," a voice rasped from the darkness. The agent froze. The voice had come from the loft above, directly over his head. "But then," the voice continued, accompanied by the distinct, terrifying snick-snick of a lever-action rifle chambering around, "Carver ain't the one holding the book, is he?" The agent didn't look up. He knew exactly who was standing above him. The metallic rasp of the voice and the faint scent of wintergreen tobacco gave him away. It was Deacon Cobb, Thomas Laramie's chief tracker, and a man who killed with the cold indifference of a butcher processing meat. "Laramie sent you to watch Carver," the agent said calmly, his hand slowly sliding the ledger into the large inner pocket of his canvas duster. "Mr. Laramie pays me to ensure his investments are secure," Cobb replied, his boots shifting slightly on the floorboards above. He noticed Carver was getting a bit too much liquid cash lately. Figured the dog was bearing a bone. "Toss the book out, stranger. Toss it in the dirt, put your hands on your head, and maybe I'll just shoot you in the knee instead of the spine." The agent remained perfectly still. His mind raced, calculating angles, distances, and the structural integrity of the loft. The wood above him was old, thick pine. A bullet from his Colt might not penetrate it cleanly enough to guarantee a hit, but Cobb had the high ground and a clear line of sight through the gaps. "I'm afraid the book goes with me, Deacon," the agent said. "Suit yourself," Cobb sighed. The agent didn't wait for the muzzle flash. He threw himself sideways, rolling violently into the adjacent stall just as a heavy .44-40 round splintered the edge of the feed trough where his head had been a fraction of a second before. The rifle report was deafening in the enclosed space, causing the horses to scream and rear in panic, their iron-shod hooves kicking furiously at their enclosures. The agent came up on one knee, his Colt drawn. He fired blindly upward, sending 2 rounds punching through the floorboards of the loft. Cobb cursed, the sound of scrambling boots indicating he was moving. Dust and splinters rained down. The agent used the chaos of the terrified horses as cover, low crawling out of the stall and moving rapidly toward the structural support beam in the center of the barn. He needed to force Cobb down to the ground floor. He spotted a coiled length of heavy hemp rope hanging from a wooden peg near the main doors, the other end attached to the large pulley system used for hoisting hay bales into the loft. 3 shots left in the Colt. The agent holstered his weapon and sprinted for the rope, his boots silent on the scattered straw. Cobb fired again, the bullet tearing through the brim of the agent's Stetson and burying itself in the dirt. The agent grabbed the rope, pulled a match from his vest pocket, struck it against his thumbnail, and touched the flame to the frayed end of the hemp. The dry fibers caught instantly, blazing with a bright, smoky light. The agent swung the burning rope like a pendulum, tossing it high into the dry, loose hay spilling over the edge of the loft. "You crazy son of a bitch!" Cobb roared from above. The hay caught fire with a soft whoosh, the flames quickly spreading across the edge of the loft, illuminating the rafters in a hellish orange glow. The smoke began to billow, thick and choking. The heat and smoke forced Cobb's hand. A dark figure dropped from the loft, hitting the dirt floor with a heavy thud near the back of the livery. Cobb rolled, bringing his Winchester up, but the smoke obscured his vision. The agent stepped out from behind the support beam, his Colt leveled. He didn't fire at the man. He fired at the rusted chain holding the heavy iron anvil suspended above the blacksmith's corner, directly over where Cobb had landed. The bullet shattered the weakened link. The anvil dropped like a stone. It didn't hit Cobb directly, but the massive iron block crashed into the edge of a water trough right next to him, exploding the thick wood and sending a tidal wave of freezing water and lethal, jagged splinters outward. Cobb screamed as a piece of oak the size of a railroad spike tore through his calf, dropping him to the ground. The agent walked forward through the smoke, the flames crackling angrily above them. He kicked the Winchester out of Cobb's hands and looked down at the writhing tracker. "Tell Laramie the Pinkertons are coming to balance the books," the agent said softly. He turned and walked out of the side door, leaving Cobb bleeding in the smoke-filled barn as the sounds of Cheyenne's volunteer fire brigade began to ring out in the distance. The Iron Cross Ranch didn't look like a cattle operation. It looked like a feudal fortress. Situated 20 miles north of Cheyenne, the main house was a sprawling 3-story Victorian mansion built of imported red brick and white marble, sitting obscenely on the flat, desolate Wyoming plains. It was surrounded by a 10-foot-high wall of stacked fieldstone, topped with vicious iron spikes. The agent rode a borrowed gray gelding up the long, sweeping driveway as the first pale light of dawn threatened to break over the eastern horizon. The sky was the color of bruised iron. He made no attempt to hide his approach. Stealth was useless here. The perimeter was actively patrolled by men carrying repeating rifles. As he approached the heavy wrought iron front gates, 4 men stepped out from the shadows of a stone gatehouse. They were hard-eyed men, wearing heavy wool coats and carrying leveled Winchesters. "That's far enough, drifter," the lead guard shouted, a tall man with a scarred jaw. "State your business or turn that nag around. This is private property." The agent pulled back on the reins, halting the horse. He didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he slowly reached into his duster and produced the black leather ledger, holding it up in the freezing morning air. "My name is of no consequence," the agent called out, his voice carrying clearly. "But I believe Mr. Thomas Laramie has been looking for this. I found it in a feed trough in Cheyenne. Tell him the man who shot Emmett Carver is here to discuss a transaction." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. The scarred man squinted at the black book, then motioned for two of his men to keep their rifles trained on the rider. He stepped backward into the gatehouse, cranking the handle of a hand-cranked field telephone, a luxury almost unheard of in the territory. Minutes stretched. The wind bit through the agent's duster, but he sat perfectly still in the saddle. Finally, the scarred man stepped back out. "Leave your iron in the saddlebags. Dismount. Keep your hands where we can see them." The agent complied. He unbuckled his gun belt, looping it over the saddle horn, and stepped down into the frozen mud. Two guards approached, patting him down roughly, finding the hunting knife in his boot and tossing it into the dirt. They didn't take the ledger. The heavy iron gates groaned open. He was escorted up the manicured gravel path to the mansion's massive oak double doors. The interior of the house was a staggering display of frontier wealth. Persian rugs covered polished mahogany floors, crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, and the walls were adorned with oil paintings of champion livestock and dead European nobility. The guards led him down a long hallway and pushed open a pair of heavy sliding doors, ushering him into a vast wood-paneled study. The room smelled of expensive cigars, old paper, and money. A massive fire roared in a stone hearth large enough to roast an ox. Sitting in a high-backed leather wing chair by the fire was Thomas Laramie. Laramie was not the brutish, uneducated thug the agent had expected. He was a man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit with silver hair combed neatly back and a neatly trimmed beard. He possessed the aristocratic air of a New England banker rather than a Western cattle king. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in one hand and a gold pocket watch in the other. "The infamous Pinkerton," Laramie said, his voice smooth, cultured, and devoid of the territorial drawl. He didn't stand. He merely gestured to a chair opposite him. "Please, sit. You must be frozen." The agent remained standing. He tossed the black ledger onto the polished surface of Laramie's massive oak desk. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. "The Union Pacific wants their land routes secured, Laramie," the agent said, cutting straight to the point. "And the federal government wants to know why you're bribing their commissioners. This book guarantees you'll hang." Laramie looked at the ledger, then took a slow sip of his drink. He smiled. It was a terrifyingly calm, genuine smile. "You shot my best enforcer, burned down half a livery stable, and crippled my chief tracker," Laramie mused. "You are a remarkably efficient employee. William Pinkerton must pay you handsomely." "I'm not here to discuss my wages." "No, I suppose you aren't," Laramie said, finally standing. He walked over to the desk, his polished shoes clicking on the hardwood floor. He picked up the black ledger, running a manicured thumb over the leather cover. "You're here to play the hero, to save the righteous homesteader and punish the wicked cattle baron." Laramie abruptly tossed the ledger into the roaring fireplace. The agent didn't flinch, but his eyes narrowed. The leather cover immediately began to blacken and curl, the pages catching fire with a bright flash. "Why would you burn your only leverage?" the agent asked, his voice low. "Leverage?" Laramie laughed softly, a dry, papery sound. "My dear boy, you are profoundly misinformed about the nature of this game." The agent watched the pages of the ledger turn to ash, the damning names and numbers disintegrating into smoke up the chimney. He calculated the distance to Laramie, the lack of weapons on his own person, and the likely presence of guards immediately outside the heavy study doors. "That was the original," the agent said. "There are no copies." "I am perfectly aware of that," Laramie replied, walking back to his chair and picking up his glass. He swirled the brandy, watching the firelight catch the amber liquid. "Tell me, Agent, when your regional supervisor in Denver, a Mr. Arthur Henderson, gave you this assignment, what exactly did he tell you?" The agent's jaw tightened. "He told me a rogue faction of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association had stolen a Union Pacific asset to blackmail the governor. My orders were to retrieve it and deliver it to federal marshals." "Ah," Laramie sighed, shaking his head with mock sympathy. "Arthur always was a master of the half-truth. It makes him an excellent liar, but a terrible partner." Laramie walked to a side table and picked up a silver humidor, offering a cigar to the agent, who ignored it. Laramie clipped the end of his own cigar with a gold cutter. "Arthur Henderson," Laramie continued, lighting the tobacco with a long wooden match, "did not send you here to retrieve that ledger for the federal government. He sent you here to retrieve it for me." The room suddenly felt much colder, despite the roaring fire. The pieces of the puzzle shifted violently in the agent's mind, forming a new, sickening picture. "Henderson is on your payroll," the agent stated flatly. "Everyone is on my payroll," Laramie corrected smoothly. "Governor Hale, the land commissioners, the local judges, and yes, your esteemed Pinkerton supervisor in Denver. You see, when Carver stole that ledger from the train, he didn't just betray me, he panicked Henderson. If that book found its way into the hands of an honest federal judge, a rare breed, but they exist, Henderson's name was in it right alongside mine. He received $10,000 to look the other way while my men forced the homesteaders off the Sweetwater tract." Laramie puffed on his cigar, exhaling a thick cloud of blue smoke. "Carver was a brute. He thought he could extort me. But I knew Carver was too cowardly to move the book out of Cheyenne. I just needed someone highly skilled, highly motivated, and entirely ignorant of the truth to go into town, flush Carver out, and find where he buried the bone." "Me. Exactly." Laramie beamed. "You are the best retriever the agency has. You brought the book right to my desk. And you did it believing you were on a righteous crusade. It is poetic, really." The agent stared at the ashes in the fireplace. His entire mission had been a manipulation. He wasn't the law-bringing justice. He was the bagman tying up loose ends for a corrupt syndicate. "So," the agent said, his voice dangerously soft, "the book is gone. The evidence is destroyed. What happens to the retriever?" Laramie's smile vanished, replaced by a gaze of cold, absolute zero. "The retriever, unfortunately, has seen too much. You know about Henderson. You know about the arrangement. You are a loose thread, and I despise loose threads." Laramie reached into his tailored suit coat and withdrew a small, beautifully engraved Smith & Wesson .32 caliber revolver. He leveled it directly at the agent's chest. At the same moment, the heavy sliding doors of the study rolled open. The scarred guard and 3 others stepped into the room, their Winchesters raised and cocked. "I respect your skills, Agent," Laramie said, his finger tightening on the trigger of the small revolver. "But you are out of your depth. You are standing in a room with 5 armed men, you have no weapons, and no one knows you are here except a corrupt supervisor who expects you to disappear." The agent looked at the 5 guns pointed at him. He didn't panic. He didn't raise his hands. Instead, a slow, dark smile spread across his face, altering his features from a cold mask into something genuinely terrifying. "You're right, Mr. Laramie," the agent said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the desk. The guards tensed, tightening their grips on their rifles. "Arthur Henderson is a terrible partner, which is why I never trusted him." Laramie frowned, his eyes darting to the ashes in the fireplace. "What are you talking about?" "I've been reading men like Henderson for 10 years, the agent said, his voice echoing in the large room. "He sweat too much when he gave me the assignment. He was too eager to keep the local marshals out of it. So before I came to Cheyenne, I wired Chicago. I didn't wire the regional office. I wired William Pinkerton directly." Laramie's confident posture faltered slightly. The .32 wavered. "A bluff. You had no proof of his corruption." "I didn't need proof," the agent replied. "I just needed to secure the real evidence." The agent gestured toward the fireplace. That book you just burned? It was a blank ledger I bought at a mercantile in Laramie City for $3. I spent 2 hours last night transcribing the first 3 pages in my own handwriting to make it look authentic at a glance. The blood drained from Thomas Laramie's face. The aristocratic facade cracked, revealing the desperate cornered animal beneath. The real ledger, the agent continued, his pale eyes gleaming with a predatory light, is currently sitting in a locked strongbox in the Cheyenne Telegraph office, set to be mailed on the noon train directly to the federal courthouse in Fort Smith, Arkansas, care of Judge Isaac Parker. Silence descended on the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. The scarred guard looked nervously at his boss. "You're lying," Laramie hissed, his hand shaking. "Shoot me and find out," the agent dared him. "If I don't walk into that telegraph office by 11 o'clock and cancel the shipment with a specific cipher code, the book goes to Parker. And Judge Parker doesn't care how much money you have, Laramie. He will hang you, he will hang Henderson, and he will hang every man in this room who tries to stop him." Laramie stared at the agent, his mind racing, trying to find the flaw in the trap. There was none. The Pinkerton had outplayed him entirely. "What do you want?" Laramie choked out, lowering the small revolver an inch. "I want my gun belt," the agent said, turning his back on the cattle baron and walking slowly, deliberately toward the study doors, walking right through the line of leveled rifles. "And I want a fast horse. If a single one of your men follows me past the property line, the book goes to Arkansas." He stopped at the doorway, looking back over his shoulder at the most powerful man in Wyoming, who was now standing utterly paralyzed by the ghost of his own hubris. "You just insulted the wrong man, Laramie," the Nameless Gunslinger said. He walked out of the study, leaving the cattle baron standing in the ashes of his empire. The ride back to Cheyenne was a frozen, nerve-shredding ordeal. The Wyoming plains offered no cover, just an endless expanse of frost-bitten sagebrush and rolling hills beneath a sky the color of a bruised corpse. The nameless Pinkerton agent pushed the gray gelding hard, his breath pluming in the freezing air, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He had his gun belt back, the heavy weight of the Colt Peacemaker a familiar comfort against his hip, but a single revolver was little defense against a coordinated ambush by a dozen men with repeating rifles. Thomas Laramie was a cornered rat, and rats were deadliest when their escape routes were blocked. The cattle baron couldn't afford to let the agent die before noon, not without the cipher code to stop the ledger from being mailed. But Laramie also couldn't allow the agent to reach the telegraph office unmolested. The game had changed from assassination to capture. It was 9:30 in the morning when the sprawling, soot-stained rooflines of Cheyenne finally broke the horizon. The town was eerily quiet. Word of the bloodbath at the Copper Queen Saloon had spread like a prairie fire, and the sensible citizens of the territory had locked their doors and shuttered their windows. The only sounds were the howling wind and the distant rhythmic chugging of a steam locomotive in the rail yard. The agent bypassed the main street, weaving through the narrow, trash-strewn alleys behind the butcher shop and the assayer's office. He tied the exhausted gray gelding behind a stack of empty whiskey barrels and slipped toward the back door of the Western Union Telegraph office. He drew his Colt, holding it down against his leg, and turned the brass knob. It was locked. He knocked, a specific rhythmic sequence, 2 heavy taps, a pause, 3 light taps. A moment later, the lock clicked, and the heavy door opened a fraction of an inch. A pale, terrified face peered out from the gloom. It was Elias Finch, the town's telegraph operator, a frail man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. "You're late," Finch whispered, his voice trembling as he pulled the door open to let the agent slip inside. "I was about to bolt the doors and hide in the cellar." "Are we alone?" the agent asked, his pale gray eyes sweeping the cluttered, dimly lit back room. It smelled of ozone, hot copper wire, and stale coffee. "Just me," Finch swallowed hard. "And Sheriff Burnett." He's out front. He's been waiting for you since sunrise. The agent nodded slowly. He moved past Finch, parting the heavy velvet curtain that separated the back room from the front office. Sheriff John Burnett was sitting in a wooden chair near the front window, his Winchester rifle resting across his knees. He looked exhausted, his face lined with the deep grooves of a man who had spent the entire night wrestling with his conscience. "Sheriff," the agent said, his voice quiet. Burnett turned, his hand tightening on the stock of his rifle, though he didn't raise it. "I heard about the fire at Miller's Livery. Heard Deacon Cobb got his leg crushed, and I just got a wire from the Union Pacific depot down the line. Laramie's men are tearing up the roads leading out of town." "Laramie is desperate," the agent said, walking behind the telegraph counter. He looked at Finch, who had scurried back to his desk. "Do you have the package, Elias?" Finch nodded frantically. He knelt in front of a heavy Mosler iron safe tucked beneath the counter, spinning the combination dial with shaking hands. The heavy iron door swung open with a metallic groan. Finch reached inside and pulled out a plain brown paper parcel, heavily wrapped in twine and sealed with red wax. "It's all here," Finch said, placing it on the counter. "Postage paid. Addressed to Judge Isaac Parker, Fort Smith, Arkansas." Burnett stood up, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "You played Laramie for a fool. You told him the book was here. You didn't tell him the ledger never went to the livery at all. Carver was a liar, but he was predictable," the agent replied, picking up the heavy parcel. "When Carver stole the book, he didn't bury it in the dirt. He brought it here, to Finch. Paid him $100 to hold it in the company's safe until he could figure out how to sell it back to Laramie. The book in the livery was a decoy Carver planted in case Laramie's trackers came sniffing around. I found out from Carver's frightened sheep farmer, Josiah Miller, before I ever walked into the Copper Queen." Burnett shook his head in disbelief. "So, you went to the Copper Queen just to provoke them, to draw Carver out, to make Laramie think you were playing a straight game." "I needed Laramie to believe he had won, just long enough for me to get the real evidence out of the territory," the agent said. He looked at the wall clock. It was 10:15. "The morning train to Denver departs in 45 minutes. This parcel goes on the express car, and I need to make sure it gets there safely." Before Burnett could respond, the heavy glass of the front window shattered inward. A hail of bullets tore through the telegraph office, shredding the wooden counter, exploding inkwells, and showering the room in lethal shards of glass and splintered wood. Finch screamed, diving to the floor, covering his head with his hands. The agent dropped to a crouch, pulling the parcel against his chest, his right hand whipping the Colt from its holster. Burnett hit the deck beside him, racking the lever of his Winchester. "Looks like Laramie figured out the bluff," Burnett shouted over the deafening roar of gunfire tearing through the thin wooden walls. "Keep them pinned," the agent yelled back. He didn't fire. He conserved his ammunition, waiting for the pause in the barrage. Outside, a harsh voice cut through the cold air. "Pinkerton, we know you're in there. Toss the book out the door, and you can ride away. Laramie just wants his property." It was Caleb, the scarred guard from the Iron Cross estate. He had brought an army. "Elias!" the agent barked over the ringing in his ears. He grabbed the terrified clerk by the collar and hauled him toward the back door. "Get out of here. Run to the rail yard. Tell the station master to hold the Denver train until I get there. Go!" Finch didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled out the back door, disappearing into the alleyway. The agent turned back to Burnett. "We can't hold them here. They'll burn the building down around us. We have to move." Burnett nodded grimly. "The rail yard is 4 blocks east. There's no cover. It's a shooting gallery." "Then we make our own cover," the agent said, his eyes locking onto a small cast-iron stove sitting in the corner of the office, filled with glowing coals. "When I say go, you run for the alley. Don't look back." The agent grabbed a heavy woolen blanket off a nearby cot, wrapped it tightly around his left arm, and hefted a large glass kerosene lamp from the wall sconce. He waited for the next lull in the gunfire. "Now!" he roared. He hurled the kerosene lamp directly at the cast-iron stove. The glass shattered against the hot iron, and the kerosene ignited instantly in a massive, blinding fireball. The front room of the telegraph office erupted in thick, choking black smoke and searing heat, blowing out the remaining window frames and sending a wall of flame rolling toward the street. The agent and the sheriff bolted through the back door, plunging into the freezing alley just as Caleb's men began screaming in confusion at the sudden inferno. The wind whipped the black smoke from the burning telegraph office across the rooftops of Cheyenne as the agent and Sheriff Burnett sprinted through the labyrinth of back alleys toward the Union Pacific rail yard. The piercing shriek of a train whistle cut through the cold air. The 1045 Express was building steam, preparing to pull out of the station. They burst out of the alleyway and into the massive open expanse of the rail depot. Towering plumes of white steam hissed from the giant iron wheels of the locomotive, creating a dense, rolling fog across the wooden boarding platforms. Passengers were frantically boarding the passenger cars, panicked by the sound of gunfire echoing from the center of town. "The express car's at the back!" Burnett yelled, pointing toward a heavily armored green train car near the caboose. The agent clutched the brown parcel tightly, his eyes scanning the chaotic platform. The steam provided temporary cover, but it was a double-edged sword. Anyone could be waiting in the mist. As they ran toward the express car, a figure stepped out from behind a stack of heavy wooden shipping crates, blocking their path. The man was wearing a beautifully tailored charcoal gray suit beneath a heavy beaver-pelled overcoat. He held a silver-plated Smith & Wesson revolver casually in his right hand. He was smiling, but the smile didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Going somewhere, son?" the man asked. His voice was smooth, cultured, and carried the unmistakable accent of high society Boston. The agent stopped dead in his tracks, his hand hovering over his Colt. Sheriff Burnett brought his Winchester up to his shoulder. "Arthur Henderson," the agent said, his voice flat and devoid of surprise. The corrupt Pinkerton regional supervisor chuckled, stepping fully into the open. "I received a rather frantic wire from Mr. Laramie early this morning. He seemed to think you were causing him undue stress. I took the company's private rail car down from Denver to personally oversee your reassignment." From the swirling steam behind Henderson, 4 more men emerged. They weren't wearing the rough-spun wool of Laramie's cowhands. They wore the dark suits and bowler hats of Pinkerton enforcers. They carried short-barreled shotguns and heavy revolvers. Henderson had brought his own corrupt muscle to finish the job. "It's over," Henderson said, holding out his left hand. "Give me the ledger. You've played a magnificent game, truly. William Pinkerton himself would be proud of your initiative. But initiative doesn't pay the bills on the frontier. Laramie does. You're selling out the agency to a man who slaughters sheep farmers and bribes judges," the agent said, his eyes locked onto Henderson's silver revolver. "I'm ensuring the agency's survival in a changing world," Henderson countered smoothly. "The Wild West is dying, son. It's being replaced by boardrooms, land deeds, and corporate ledgers. Laramie represents the future. We can either ride the train or get crushed under its wheels. Hand over the package." The agent didn't move. He felt the heavy weight of the parcel in his left hand, the cold grip of the Colt in his right. He looked at the 4 armed men flanking his former boss. "I told Laramie he made a mistake trusting you, Arthur," the agent said softly, the wind carrying his words across the platform. "Because you're a coward. You surround yourself with gunmen, but you've never actually stood on the line yourself." Henderson's smile faltered, his face flushing with sudden anger. "Kill them both!" he snapped at his men. "Take the book from his corpse!" The Pinkerton enforcers raised their weapons, but before they could fire, a massive, thunderous voice boomed from the roof of the express car above them. "Federal marshals, drop your weapons by order of the United States government." Henderson and his men looked up in shock. Standing atop the armored train car, silhouetted against the gray sky, were 6 men armed with repeating rifles, their tin stars gleaming dully on their chests. At their center stood U.S. Marshal Samuel Bowman, a legendary lawman known for hanging outlaws without the courtesy of a blindfold. The agent hadn't just wired William Pinkerton. He had wired the federal courthouse in Fort Smith 3 days ago, arranging for Marshal Bowman's detachment to secretly guard the express car in Cheyenne. In that split second of utter confusion, as Henderson's men hesitated between firing on the agent or turning their guns on the federal marshals, the Nameless Gunslinger made his move. He didn't draw fast, he drew smooth. The Colt cleared leather in a blur of practiced, lethal precision. He fanned the hammer twice. The first bullet struck the Pinkerton enforcer holding the shotgun, spinning him off the platform and onto the tracks. The second bullet tore through the shoulder of the man next to him. Henderson panicked. The refined, cultured bureaucrat vanished, replaced by a terrified animal. He raised his silver revolver and fired wildly at the agent. The bullet grazed the agent's ribs, tearing through his canvas duster, but the agent didn't flinch. He stepped forward, closing the distance, his eyes locked on Henderson. He cocked the hammer a third time. Henderson stumbled backward, tripping over a piece of luggage, his silver gun waving uselessly in the air. "Wait! Wait! We can make a deal! I have money! I have—" The agent fired. The heavy .45 caliber slug caught Arthur Henderson square in the chest, stopping his words instantly. The corrupt supervisor collapsed onto the wooden planks, his sightless eyes staring up at the Wyoming sky. Above them, Marshal Bowman's men opened fire, laying down a suppressing barrage that forced the remaining 2 Pinkerton thugs to drop their weapons and raise their hands in surrender. The rail yard fell silent, save for the hissing steam of the locomotive and the groans of the wounded. The agent slowly lowered his Colt. He didn't look at the body of his former boss. He turned and walked to the door of the express car. Marshal Bowman climbed down from the roof, his boots crunching heavily on the platform. He was a massive man with a thick gray mustache and eyes like chips of flint. He looked at the dead bodies, then at the agent. "You cut it awful close, Pinkerton," Bowman grumbled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the tracks. "I had to make sure all the rats were out of the walls before you set the trap, Marshal," the agent replied. He held out the brown paper parcel. "Evidence for Judge Parker, the financial ruin of Thomas Laramie, and proof of Arthur Henderson's treason." Bowman took the package, testing its weight. "This little book is going to hang a lot of wealthy men in this territory. Laramie's empire is done." He looked closely at the agent, noting the blood seeping through the tear in the canvas duster. "You need a doctor, son, and a name for my report. The bullet just grazed me. I've had worse from a jealous husband," the agent said, his face expressionless. He turned his back on the train. "And as for the report, just tell the judge a ghost delivered the mail." By mid-afternoon, the town of Cheyenne had begun to cautiously open its doors. The fires at the livery stable and the telegraph office had been extinguished by the volunteer brigade, leaving behind charred scars on the face of the frontier town. The power dynamic of the territory had shifted in the span of 4 hours. U.S. Marshal Bowman had marched his deputies straight from the rail yard to the Iron Cross estate. They found Thomas Laramie sitting in his study, drinking expensive brandy and staring at the ashes in his fireplace. He hadn't resisted arrest. Without his corrupt Pinkerton shielding him, and with the ledger securely on a train to Arkansas, the cattle baron knew the war was over. He would face Judge Isaac Parker, and no amount of Wyoming gold could buy a pardon from the hanging judge. Sheriff Burnett had spent the afternoon locking up the remnants of Laramie's enforcers, the scarred man Caleb among them, their morale shattered by the fall of their invincible boss and the death of Arthur Henderson. The nameless Pinkerton agent stood at the edge of town, near the livery where the ordeal had truly begun. The wind had died down, and a gentle powdery snow had begun to fall, dusting the muddy streets in a layer of pristine white. He had traded his exhausted gray gelding for a sturdy black Morgan horse from a local trader, paying with gold coins from a heavy leather purse. His duster was stitched, his guns were cleaned and loaded, and his saddlebags were packed for a long ride. He stood near the telegraph pole, watching a young boy nail a fresh poster to the wood. It was a notice of auction for the seized assets of the Iron Cross Ranch. The homesteaders, men like Josiah Miller, would finally get to keep their land. Sheriff Burnett walked up beside him, his breath pluming in the cold air. He handed the agent a folded piece of yellow telegraph paper. "Just came over the wire from Chicago," Burnett said, his tone respectful. "Sent priority to the station master, addressed to the man in the duster." The agent took the paper and unfolded it. It was a short encrypted message, decipherable only by top-tier agency operatives. He read the translation in his mind. "Henderson's treason confirmed. Laramie secured. Your contract is fulfilled. Awaiting your return to Chicago for reassignment. Excellent work. William Pinkerton." The agent stared at the words for a long moment. He thought about the bloodshed, the corruption, and the endless cycle of violence that fueled the expansion of the West. He thought about men like Carver, who killed for pleasure, and men like Laramie, who killed for ledgers. And he thought about the agency, an institution that claimed to bring order, but was so easily corrupted by the very wealth it sought to protect. He slowly struck a match, touched it to the corner of the yellow paper, and watched as the telegram curled into black ash, the wind carrying the cinders away into the falling snow. "You going back to Chicago?" Burnett asked, watching the paper burn. "No," the agent said softly, his pale gray eyes staring out at the endless white horizon of the Wyoming plains. "I think I've spent enough time balancing other men's books." He swung up into the saddle of the Black Morgan, the leather creaking in the quiet afternoon. He pulled the collar of his heavy duster up against the chill and tipped his worn Stetson to the sheriff. "Where will you go?" Burnett called out. The Nameless Gunslinger didn't answer. He simply spurred the horse forward, riding out of Cheyenne at a slow, measured walk. He rode past the burnt telegraph office, past the silent saloons, and out into the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the frontier. He didn't look back. He vanished into the falling snow, a nameless phantom, leaving behind only the legend of the wrong man. The myth of the Wild West isn't just about fast draws and saloon brawls. It's about the brutal reality of power, corruption, and the solitary figures who stood in the crossfire. The story of our nameless Pinkerton agent shows us that the deadliest weapon on the frontier wasn't always a Colt .45. Sometimes it was a ledger of truths that powerful men would kill to keep buried. But in a world ruled by outlaws and corrupt barons, one ghost with a badge was enough to bring an empire to its knees. Did you enjoy this gritty dive into frontier justice? Hit that like button and share this video with your fellow history and Western fans. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more immersive storytelling. Drop a comment below. If this nameless gunslinger had a real identity, who do you think he was? Let's discuss in the comments.